In this video, I'll show how we can use Skupper for redundancy and also for a traffic migration use case. So just looking at this little diagram here, in this setup we have a west cluster and an east cluster. We have the exact same app deployed to both clusters. So we have an ingress, a service pod. We also have the Skupper router set up here, and we have the exact same ingress, service, and pod and Skupper router over here. Now, the IP address will be different on either one for either ingress. So we can route to either ingress as we see fit. So there is a link set up between these two Skupper sites. However, we haven't exposed any services between the two clusters just yet. So we'll do that during the steps here. So I've already got all of these things up and running. What I'm going to do first is just verify that we can hit the HTTP endpoint of the ingress on both sides. So I have a couple of commands for that here. So let's take them here and I'll explain what we're seeing here. So the first one here, it's getting a response from this particular pod. It's just echoing back what we've sent to it. And the second one here, it's echoed back from a different pod. So it's hitting two different clusters. And we can see here the host it's going to is different for either one as well. So it's going to either cluster. So that's the first step. We can route directly to either cluster. So next, there's a small step here just to enable exposing. I'll just move on quickly past this. This is from a previous example, but the code is there for this one too. So let's move on. We want to expose the app service from each site, in other words, in both directions. And I'll explain why we want to do that. So let's kick off this first. So the echo deployment on the west is exposed to the east cluster and vice versa. By doing that, Skupper is smart enough to see when traffic comes in for that particular service in one cluster, it will see that this service, if it has one or more endpoints, in other words, if it's healthy, it will route to that service in that cluster. And if there's an issue with the endpoints for that service, for whatever reason, Skupper reconfigures things so that if you do send traffic to that service, it actually gets proxied across. What I mean there, if we jump back to the diagram, as I send traffic in here to the west cluster, for example, hits the ingress, gets routed to the service. If there's no pods, in other words, no endpoints behind that service, Skupper will have reconfigured this to route over the Skupper link here to the service on the other side, because we have the same name service on both sides and we've exposed it in both directions. So that's giving you that redundancy. From a traffic migration point of view, it can allow you to, say, take workloads off the air here, but just leave the service and ingress for a time if you still want to have traffic coming into that cluster. And it can be routed to the workload over on the east cluster until you want to, say, decommission the west cluster, for example. Okay, so we've done the exposing of the deployments. What I'm going to do now is scale down the app pod on the east cluster. So on the east side here, we'll scale down that pod and we'll see what happens when we try to hit the ingress, the 0.3 ingress on this side. So let's do that. Let's target that cluster and we'll scale down. So now we should still be able to hit the west cluster, cluster 1. We're still getting a response here, that's good. But if we hit cluster 2, what do we get? We still get a response. So what's actually happened here, we need to look at the details of what's coming back here to see that it's actually routed across the Skupper network to the other cluster. And we can see that by looking at what's actually served the request here. So in the west cluster, it's served by this particular pod. So QNCDJ is what it ends with there. And now that it's for the request that went to the east cluster, even though the pod is not running, it has got a response from the pod in the west cluster as well. Same thing here, is QNCDJ. Let's scale things back up. So straight away here, we are hitting the original pod, or rather the new pod on the east cluster. And that is it.